Beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers of Manhattan's most exclusive ballroom, the air felt thick with a suffocating mix of expensive perfume and cold-blooded betrayal. My name is Madison Sinclair, and as a 26-year-old witness to this nightmare, I watched my brilliant older sister Valerie Sinclair sit in crushing silence while her world began to crumble. She was 32, the true architectural mind behind the sterling corporate empire, yet she was being treated like an invisible ghost at her own anniversary gala. The man she had built into a titan, her husband Julian, stood on the velvet-draped stage while swirling a vintage scotch with a smirk that made my blood run cold. "Julian, the guests are waiting for you to acknowledge the new design patent," Valerie whispered, leaning toward him with a hopeful yet exhausted smile. He didn't even look at her instead. He laughed dryly and adjusted his silk tie while addressing the entire front row of investors. "My success belongs solely to the vision of a man because women are designed for the background for the domestic silence that allows true leaders like me to thrive," Julian declared loudly to a chorus of mocking laughter from his entire family. I felt my stomach churn as his mother leaned over and sneered directly into Valerie's ear. "Just sit there and look pretty for the cameras, dear, because your only job is to be an accessory to my son's greatness." Valerie didn't cry or scream, but the way her fingers tightened around her crystal glass until her knuckles turned white told me a dormant fire was finally beginning to ignite. "Is that all I am to you, Julian, a silent accessory to the empire I actually built?" she asked in a low, dangerous tone that only our table could hear. He barely glanced back at her before dismissing her with a flick of his wrist, saying, "Go get me another drink and stop imagining you're more than a housewife, Valerie." Every pair of eyes in that room turned toward my sister, who sat isolated at the far end of the long mahogany table like a fallen queen amongst scavengers. I saw the exact moment her grief transformed into a lethal resolve. "Before I show you the devastating evidence Valerie used to dismantle his entire life piece by piece over the next 3 years, make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on all notifications. You will not want to miss a single second of this masterpiece of revenge, so stay tuned until the very end to see how the crown was reclaimed." The silence that followed our departure from the gala felt like a heavy shroud draped over the cold marble floors of the Upper East Side penthouse. For over a year, that luxurious space became a gilded prison where Valerie was systematically stripped of her dignity and her brilliant mind by the man who vowed to protect her. Julian didn't even wait for the dust to settle before he brought his mistress, a sharp-featured woman named Elena Vance, into the very home they shared. Valerie, stop standing there like a statue and take Elena's coat, because she will be staying in the guest suite for the foreseeable future," Julian commanded while pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon. I watched my sister's face tighten in silent agony as she was forced to act like a common servant for the woman blatantly sleeping with her husband. "I hope you don't mind, Valerie, but Julian says I have much better taste in interior design than a bored housewife," Elena sneered while running a manicured finger along the mahogany sideboard. The cruelty didn't stop at mere humiliation because Julian began to slip small, bitter-tasting pills into Valerie's nightly tea to cloud her judgment and suppress her natural defiance. Whenever I visited, I noticed her sharp, analytical gaze becoming glazed and distant, as if she were trapped behind a thick wall of fog. "You seem so confused lately, Valerie, so perhaps you should just sign these patent renewals and let me handle the heavy lifting for the Sinclair engine designs," Julian would murmur while stroking her hair with a chilling, predatory affection. He was slowly draining her intellectual property under the guise of concern, while her body grew frail and her hands shook during simple tasks. "Just sign the papers, Valerie, because your mind clearly isn't what it used to be, and I'm the only one keeping this family afloat," he whispered harshly when she hesitated over a signature. Every Sunday, Julian's parents, whom I knew as Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, would arrive to pour salt into her open wounds with their vicious tongues. My parents, Dad and Mom, were told Valerie was suffering from a nervous breakdown and needed total isolation to recover properly. Julian's mother would lean in close during dinner just to whisper how a woman who couldn't produce an heir was essentially a faulty piece of machinery. A sterling man deserves a fertile legacy, Valerie, yet you sit here wasting space in a family that values results above all else. The older woman sneered while Julian nodded in silent agreement. They all knew Julian had been secretly administering contraceptives to ensure Valerie remained childless and vulnerable, yet they played their roles in this charade with sickening perfection. Maybe if you were half the woman Elena is my son, wouldn't have to look elsewhere for companionship, Mrs. Sterling added with a dry, rattling laugh. One stormy night, I decided to bypass the security codes and sneak into the apartment because Valerie hadn't answered my messages for 3 terrifying weeks. I found her locked in a windowless storage room near the back of the kitchen, where the air was stale and the only light came from a flickering bulb. Valerie was curled on a thin mattress, her skin pale as parchment and her eyes darting around the shadows in a state of induced paranoia. Madison, you shouldn't be here because Julian says the walls have ears and the medicine makes everything feel so loud, she whispered while clutching my hand with a desperate, bone-deep strength. It was in that moment of absolute despair that I realized Julian wasn't just trying to break her spirit, but was actively erasing her existence. I hid behind the heavy velvet curtains of the study when I heard Julian's heavy footsteps approaching, followed by the clinical detached voice of a man I recognized as his private lawyer, Silas Reed. The inheritance clause in the Sinclair Trust is quite specific, Julian, but a fatal accident involving her medication would simplify the transfer of power significantly, Silas stated while laying out a series of legal documents on the desk. Julian chuckled darkly as he lit a cigar, the smoke curling around his head like a sinister halo in the dim light of the office. Valerie is already halfway to the grave with the dosages I've been giving her, so a small slip on the stairs or an accidental overdose wouldn't surprise anyone at this point, he replied with a chilling lack of remorse. Hearing those words seemed to act like a jolt of lightning through Valerie's drug-induced haze as she stood trembling in the shadows next to me. The fog in her eyes suddenly cleared to reveal a cold, razor-sharp clarity that I hadn't seen since the night of the gala. He's not just taking my company, Madison. He's actually planning to bury me so he can marry that woman with my father's money, she whispered with a voice that had regained its steel. She finally understood that her love had been met with a death sentence and that the man she helped build was now her primary executioner. Valerie didn't make another sound, but the way her jaw set and her breathing slowed told me that the victim was finally dead and a survivor was being born. We waited in the darkness until the house fell silent, knowing that the time for tears had passed and the era of silent, lethal retribution had finally arrived. The transition from a broken victim to a silent predator began the moment I realized Julian's arrogance would be his ultimate undoing. Exactly 1 year had passed since Valerie was forced into that gilded cage, but the woman who once stared vacantly at the walls had replaced her despair with a mask of perfect, chilling obedience. She started choosing the exact shade of silk ties Julian preferred and prepared his favorite dry martinis without being asked, acting like the broken housewife he so desperately wanted her to be. You finally seem to understand your place in this house. Valerie and I must say that your submission makes our lives much more efficient, Julian remarked, while leaning back in his leather chair with an air of absolute victory. Valerie didn't flinch at his condescension. Instead, she offered a practiced, submissive smile that hid the sharp intelligence returning to her eyes. I only want what is best for the sterling named Julian, because your success is the only thing that matters now, she replied while meticulously organizing the library shelves. Inside the margins of those old classic novels, she began leaving coded messages for me to find during my weekly visits to the penthouse. I would bring boxes of her childhood belongings under the guise of decluttering our parents' home, but those boxes contained encrypted devices and legal documents hidden within the linings. Valerie spent her afternoons in Julian's home office, appearing to be merely cleaning or filing papers, but she was actually accessing the core source codes of the Sterling architecture software. She found the backdoors she had originally built into the system and started subtly altering the algorithms to divert small, untraceable percentages of licensing fees into an offshore account. The ghost is active, Madison, and every day, Julian celebrates his fake success. He is actually funding the very weapon that will destroy him. Valerie whispered to me while we stood in the kitchen pretending to discuss a charity bake sale. Marcus Thorne had established a sophisticated financial ghost network that allowed these funds to vanish before Julian's accountants could ever flag a discrepancy. I became her primary courier, smuggling encrypted hard drives out of the building inside my designer handbags, while the security guards Julian hired watched us with bored, unsuspecting eyes. One evening, Julian returned home smelling of expensive cigars and boasting about a massive expansion project that required him to leverage the Sinclair family's remaining land holdings. "Your father is being stubborn about the coastal development, so I've decided to take out a private high-interest loan using our marital assets as collateral," Julian stated while carelessly tossing a stack of loan applications onto the dining table. Valerie picked up the documents with trembling hands, though it wasn't out of fear, but rather the sheer adrenaline of seeing Julian walk directly into the financial trap she had helped set. "Are you sure this is wise, Julian? Because the interest rates on these private equity loans seem dangerously aggressive for a long-term project," she asked with just enough feigned concern to make him feel superior. Julian laughed at her warning, his ego so bloated by his recent streak of stolen successes that he felt entirely invincible against any market fluctuation. "Stick to choosing the wallpaper, Valerie, because I didn't build this empire by being afraid to take risks that would make a Sinclair flinch," he snapped before scrawling his signature on the bottom of a $20 million credit line. Little did he know that the private equity firm providing the loan was actually a front for the Sinclair Trust, effectively making him a debtor to the very woman he was trying to replace. While Julian celebrated with Elena in the living room, Valerie retreated to the shadows of the hallway and began transmitting the final batch of stolen data to Marcus Thorne's secure server. Her mental health appeared to be improving on the surface, which allowed her to demand more freedom to walk in the garden or visit the local library without a constant security escort. Dad had received her coded signals through the old books I delivered, and he was now coordinating with an elite team of forensic accountants to map out every single one of Julian's illegal transactions. "The bridge is almost built, Madison, and once we cross it, there will be nothing left of the Sterling name but ashes and debt," Valerie told me as we sat on the terrace overlooking the city lights. Julian continued to parade around Manhattan as the new king of industry, never realizing that the foundation of his throne was being dismantled piece by piece by the wife he considered a broken accessory. By the time the calendar rolled into the second year of this nightmare, Julian had become so intoxicated by his own perceived dominance that he truly believed Valerie was nothing more than a broken shadow in his peripheral vision. This overconfidence provided the perfect opening for the introduction of a new player in our strategic game, a stunning and sharp-witted woman named Cassandra Vane, who approached Julian as a high-stakes real estate mogul with deep connections in the Middle East. Cassandra invited Julian to an exclusive rooftop lounge where she laid out the blueprints for a multi-billion-dollar luxury development project in Dubai that promised astronomical returns. "Julian, a man with your specific architectural boldness shouldn't be wasting time on local residential projects when the international market is screaming for a leader like you," Cassandra said while sliding a leather-bound prospectus across the table with a knowing smile. Julian practically vibrated with greed as he studied the projected profit margins, his eyes glazing over with the sheer vanity that Valerie and I had spent months counting on. This is exactly what I need to finally step out of the Sinclair shadow and show the world who really runs this empire," Julian boasted while signaling the waiter for another round of the most expensive scotch on the menu. Valerie played her part with haunting perfection, acting as the fearful and hesitant wife who begged him not to take such a massive financial risk during a quiet dinner at home. "Julian, please consider the stability of our current holdings before you commit the Sinclair family legacy to a project so far away and so incredibly expensive," she pleaded while pretending to wipe a stray tear from her cheek. Her feigned weakness only served to fuel his arrogance, driving him to prove that he was far more capable than any Sinclair had ever been in the history of New York real estate. "You've always been small-minded, Valerie, so just stay in your lane and let a real visionary build a monument that will make this entire city look like a playground," Julian snapped before dismissively turning his back on her to take a call from his offshore brokers. I supplemented this psychological trap by leaking carefully crafted documents that suggested my father was secretly trying to block the Dubai deal to keep Julian under his thumb forever. "Julian, I overheard Dad talking to his attorneys about freezing your access to the coastal development funds just to ensure you stay dependent on his approval," I told him in a staged moment of sisterly concern. This fabricated threat pushed Julian over the edge of reason, causing him to seek out private financing options that would bypass the Sinclair family oversight entirely. Cassandra Vane was waiting in the shadows with a series of high-interest loan agreements that included a lethal clause, allowing for the immediate seizure of all assets in the event of a single missed payment. "I don't need the Sinclair approval to build a legacy, Cassandra, so give me the pen and let's make history before they even realize I've left them behind," Julian declared, while scrawling his signature on documents that effectively tied his neck to a financial guillotine. Little did he realize that Cassandra was actually a close associate of Marcus Thorne and had been reporting every single move to Valerie since the very first meeting. While Julian was busy envisioning his name in gold letters on the Dubai skyline, Valerie was quietly working with Marcus to execute the next phase of our total destruction. We established a sophisticated shell company based in the Cayman Islands called Onyx Holdings, which began aggressively purchasing Julian's personal debts from various secondary lenders at a significant discount. Valerie used the funds she had diverted through the Ghost Network to ensure that every cent Julian owed was slowly being funneled back into a pool that she controlled with absolute authority. The hunter is so focused on the imaginary prey in Dubai that he hasn't noticed the ground being removed from beneath his feet, Valerie whispered to me as we reviewed the latest acquisition reports. Julian's family, the Sterlings, were already beginning to spend money they didn't have, boasting to their social circles about the impending Dubai fortune that would elevate their name. Once this deal closes, Julian will finally be free to marry someone who actually brings value to the table instead of just a stagnant name, Mrs. Sterling sneered during a crowded charity event. Every insult and every act of betrayal was being recorded in our mental ledgers, adding fuel to the fire that was now raging beneath Valerie's calm exterior. We watched the sunset from the penthouse balcony, knowing that the trap was finally set and the countdown to Julian's total ruin had officially begun. 30 months had passed since that humiliating gala night, and the towering house of cards Julian built finally began to disintegrate under the scorching heat of federal scrutiny. The prestigious Dubai project was exposed as a massive international fraud, causing every major bank in Manhattan to simultaneously freeze Julian's corporate accounts and demand immediate repayment of their loans. Julian stormed into the penthouse with a face twisted in primal rage, his expensive silk shirt stained with sweat, as he threw a stack of legal notices at Valerie's feet. "You are going to sign over the entire Sinclair estate to me right now, Valerie, because I will not let your father's greed destroy the empire I spent years building," he screamed while gripping her shoulders with a violence that made my blood run cold. I stood hidden in the kitchen pantry with my phone camera recording every second of his physical assault, capturing the raw evidence of his desperation and his criminal intent. Is this the visionary leader the world admires, Julian, a man who resorts to physical threats when his fraudulent dreams finally hit a wall? Valerie asked in a steady voice that sounded like a funeral bell for his ambitions. He shoved her back against the mahogany desk, his eyes wild with a terrifying mix of entitlement and sheer panic. I don't care about your little speeches, so just sign the transfer papers before I lose my patience and do something we both know you won't survive, Julian threatened while grabbing a heavy crystal decanter from the sideboard. While Julian was losing his mind inside the penthouse, the rest of the Sterling family was experiencing their own personalized version of a living hell as professional debt collectors arrived to seize their assets. The once proud and arrogant Sterling family was being publicly evicted from their country clubs and social circles, their names dragged through the mud of every tabloid in the city. Julian, you told us this Dubai deal was a guaranteed fortune. So how dare you let these common thugs touch my designer jewelry and vintage cars? His mother shrieked over the speakerphone while her voice cracked with the realization of their permanent social death. Valerie suddenly stood up and brushed Julian's hands off her, as if he were nothing more than a bothersome insect, her posture radiating a newfound lethal authority. She walked over to the safe, pulled out a folder of documents from Onyx Holdings, and tossed them onto the coffee table with a thud that echoed through the silent room. You aren't just losing your company to the banks, Julian, because you've actually spent the last 2 years selling your soul to a creditor you never bothered to identify, she stated while watching the color drain from his face. Julian scrambled to read the ownership papers of the Cayman Islands Shell Company, his hands trembling as he realized that every single cent of his personal debt was now owned by his wife. What kind of sick game is this, Valerie? Because there is no way you had the resources or the brains to orchestrate a financial takeover of this magnitude right under my nose, he bellowed while collapsing onto the floor in a heap of broken glass. You were so busy looking for a legacy in the desert that you failed to notice I was buying your life piece by piece while you were busy playing king, Valerie added with a cold, triumphant smirk that shattered whatever remained of his fragile ego. The realization that the woman he called a useless accessory had been his silent executioner for 3 years drove Julian into a state of incoherent, frothing madness. He began tearing the expensive paintings off the walls and smashing the designer furniture, howling like a wounded animal trapped in a cage of its own making. I was the one who deserved the glory, yet you sat there like a ghost while stealing everything I worked for. He screamed while reaching for her one last time in a desperate, futile attempt at control. Valerie didn't offer him a single word of comfort or a glance of pity. Instead, she simply signaled me to stop recording and prepare for the final legal strike. Every calculated move she made during those 30 months of suffering had led to this exact moment of absolute, undeniable victory over the man who thought he could break her. We stood over him as he sobbed in the ruins of his stolen kingdom, knowing that the time for hidden plans was over and the era of public judgment was finally here. The clock on the wall of the Sterling Corp boardroom struck 10 o'clock, marking the exact 3-year anniversary of the night Julian publicly branded Valerie a useless accessory. Julian sat at the head of the long mahogany table with a desperate sweat soaking through his designer suit as he looked at the stony faces of the board members who had been summoned for this emergency session. He tried to open his mouth to offer another lie about the Dubai funding, but the heavy double doors swung open with a force that silenced the entire room. Valerie marched inside, wearing a tailored power suit in a shade of blood red that commanded every ounce of oxygen in the atmosphere. She didn't wait for an invitation. Instead, she walked directly to the head of the table and signaled for Julian to vacate the seat he had stolen from her father's legacy. You are in my chair, Julian, and since I now control 62% of the voting shares through Onyx Holdings, I suggest you move before security assists you, Valerie stated with a cold, predatory grace. Julian tried to sputter a protest about marital assets, but his voice died in his throat when he saw Cassandra Vane enter the room right behind her. Valerie, you can't be serious about this corporate coup, because we both know you don't have the legal standing to challenge my authority in this company, Julian hissed while gripping the edge of the table. Cassandra didn't spare him a single glance of pity as she placed a silver flash drive onto the central console to activate the room's high-definition audio system. For the past 18 months, every conversation regarding the Dubai shell companies and the offshore money laundering schemes has been recorded for federal review, Cassandra announced to the horrified board members. The room filled with the crystal-clear sound of Julian's own voice bragging about inflating asset values and bribing international officials to keep the Sinclair family in the dark. The directors began whispering in frantic tones about legal liability, while Julian collapsed back into a chair, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal realizing the walls were closing in for good. I stepped forward from the shadows of the corner holding a remote control that connected my phone directly to the massive projection screen. The financial crimes are only the beginning of what this man has done to the Sinclair name, so I think it is time for everyone to see the true face of the sterling visionary, I said while pressing play on the video. Every board member watched in stunned silence as Julian admitted on camera to systematically poisoning his wife with sedatives just to steal her intellectual property and architectural patents. I hope the view from the top was worth it, Julian, because the footage of you threatening my sister's life is currently being uploaded to every major news outlet in the city, I added while the room erupted into a chaotic storm of outrage and disgust. Julian fell to his knees in the center of the boardroom, his hands clutching his head as he realized his entire family and his fraudulent empire had been hollowed out from within. You did this to me, Valerie. You spent every single day of our marriage planning to destroy my life, while I was trying to build something for our future. He wailed with a delusional sense of victimhood. Valerie leaned over the table, her eyes reflecting the cold fire of a woman who had survived hell and returned with the keys to the kingdom. I didn't destroy you, Julian. I simply gave you the rope and watched with great interest while you tied the noose around your own neck. She whispered loud enough for every recording device to capture her final victory. Just as the chaos reached its peak, a team of elite FBI agents and federal police officers, led by a stern man named Special Agent Miller, burst into the room with their badges held high. They moved with clinical precision surrounding Julian and pulling his hands behind his back to snap the cold steel of handcuffs around his wrists in front of the flashing cameras. Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for federal securities fraud, grand larceny, and felony assault with intent to distribute controlled substances, Agent Miller declared, while reading him his rights amidst the blinding strobe lights. The prestigious halls of Sterling Corp were filled with the sound of Julian's pathetic sobbing as he was dragged toward the elevators, stripped of his dignity and his freedom. Valerie stood perfectly still at the head of the table, her silhouette framed by the skyline of the city she had reclaimed from a monster. We watched the elevator doors close on the man who thought he could own a Sinclair, knowing that the 3-year nightmare was finally over and the true era of Valerie Sinclair was just beginning. The dust had finally begun to settle exactly 15 days after Julian was led away in handcuffs, and the once mighty Sterling Empire was officially delisted from the stock exchange as a worthless entity. Julian sat in a sterile federal holding cell awaiting his formal indictment on a laundry list of charges including attempted murder by slow poisoning and multi-state wire fraud. The prosecutors were already pushing for a mandatory minimum sentence of 30 years, citing the overwhelming digital evidence that Valerie and I had meticulously collected over the last 3 years. While Julian faced the reality of a life behind bars, his parents were experiencing the brutal consequences of their complicity as they were evicted from their final luxury apartment. Every piece of Sinclair-funded jewelry and every offshore account had been frozen or seized, leaving the Sterling family with absolutely zero resources to hire even a mediocre defense attorney for their son. We are being treated like common criminals on the evening news, and you won't even pick up the phone to help your own husband's parents save some dignity." Julian's mother screamed into my voicemail before her service was disconnected. Valerie didn't waste a second of her time on their pathetic pleas. Instead, she sat in the lawyer's office to sign the final divorce decree that would sever her connection to the sterling name forever. Julian had sent several desperate, tear-stained letters from jail, begging for a second chance or a financial settlement, but Valerie tossed them into the shredder without reading a single word. "The only thing Julian Sterling deserves from this family is the silence of his own grave, so stop wasting your ink on a woman who no longer exists to you," Valerie stated while handing the signed documents back to our lead attorney. We stood on the sidewalk across from the corporate headquarters and watched as a massive crane began the process of removing the tarnished Sterling logo from the building's facade. Julian, who was being transported to a high-security facility, was reportedly heard screaming in futile desperation as he caught a glimpse of the skyline on a television screen. "That is my name. They are tearing down. That is my legacy. They are erasing like I never existed at all." He bellowed while the guards ignored his pathetic tantrum with practiced indifference. The iconic letters were being replaced by the Sinclair Tower name in a grand, majestic display of restoration that signaled the true return of our family's honor to the city. Beyond the legal prison walls, the reality of losing his reputation and citizenship rights in the United States turned Julian into a social ghost before he even stepped into a courtroom. He was a convicted predator in the eyes of the public, a man whose existence was now a cautionary tale of greed and the fatal mistake of underestimating a Sinclair woman. The social circles that once worshipped his fake vision now spoke of him with a mixture of mockery and absolute disgust, ensuring that he would never find a place in society again. Valerie looked up at the new Sinclair Tower with a serene expression, knowing that the price of her silence had been high, but the cost of her revenge was worth every single moment of suffering. "The blueprints for my new life don't include room for any more ghosts, Madison, because I am finally building something that belongs only to me," she whispered while the last piece of the Sterling sign hit the pavement with a final satisfying crash. We walked away from the scene of our victory without looking back, leaving the ruins of the Sterling name to be buried by the very history Julian tried so hard to rewrite. The fire that had nearly consumed Valerie was now the light that guided her toward a future where she was no longer a victim, but the undisputed architect of her own destiny. 3 years of turbulent storm have finally passed, and Valerie Sinclair now stands at the absolute zenith of New York's corporate and social hierarchy, with a radiance that suggests she was born for this throne. The Sinclair Group has flourished under her vision, becoming a global beacon of innovation and ethical leadership that has completely redefined the architectural landscape of the city. I watched her address a crowd of thousands at the opening of her latest sustainable development project, and the sheer power in her voice made every person in the room lean forward in silence. Madison, looking back at those dark years in the penthouse, feels like watching a movie about someone I no longer recognize, because that woman died so I could finally live, she told me while we shared a quiet moment on the terrace. Her success is not just a personal victory, but a loud and clear message to every person who ever thought they could break a Sinclair spirit for their own gain. The contrast between her current life and the miserable existence of Julian is nothing short of a divine orchestration of justice that satisfies every ounce of my soul. I recently received a report about Julian's life inside the federal penitentiary, where he has become a target of ridicule among the other inmates who have no respect for his kind of cowardice. He spends his days performing the most menial tasks for a few cents an hour, his once manicured hands now calloused and stained by the filth of a prison kitchen. Julian keeps sending petitions for a sentence reduction, but the warden told me he spends his nights sobbing while staring at the flickering shadows on his cell wall, our attorney mentioned during a brief update. The man who thought he was a visionary king is now a nameless number in a sea of forgotten criminals, living in a cycle of poverty and shame that he can never escape. His parents, the once arrogant Sterlings, have suffered an equally humiliating downfall as they were forced to relocate to a crumbling tenement in a neglected part of the city. I spotted Julian's mother waiting for a bus in the rain a few weeks ago, and her designer coat had been replaced by a cheap polyester jacket that looked as worn out as her reputation. "I never imagined we would end up in a place like this, Madison, so please tell Valerie that we are truly sorry for everything that happened in that house," she whispered when she saw me, but I simply walked past her without acknowledging her existence. They are living in a permanent state of disgrace, haunted by the memories of the luxury they once enjoyed, while actively participating in the destruction of a woman's life. Valerie decided to transform her past trauma into a powerful instrument of change by establishing the Sinclair Foundation for Empowered Women to help those trapped in similar hells. I want every woman to know that their silence is not their weakness, but a weapon they can sharpen into a tool for their own liberation," Valerie declared during the Foundation's inaugural gala. She has dedicated her life to ensuring that no other woman has to navigate the darkness of domestic abuse without a formidable shield and a clear path toward financial independence. The lessons we learned through this grueling war have become the foundation of a movement that prioritizes self-respect and the absolute necessity of controlling one's own destiny. The strongest weapon a woman can possess is not just a sharp mind, but the unwavering courage to be financially independent and emotionally sovereign in every situation. We have seen firsthand that even the most calculated predators can be dismantled if you have the patience to build your own fortress while they are busy celebrating their stolen victories. Valerie's journey is a testament to the fact that your current circumstances do not define your final destination as long as you refuse to let anyone else write your script. Thank you for walking through this long and intense journey of justice and transformation with us until the very final chapter of this story, I said, while looking directly into the camera for the closing scene. We would be honored if you would share your personal thoughts and reflections on Valerie's story in the comments section below to keep this conversation alive. Do you believe that true justice was served? Or is there more to the price of betrayal that remains to be paid by those who hurt us? Your support means the world to us, and we look forward to hearing your perspective on the strength of the human spirit in our next video.